High class. So we're going to take a look at America during the 1920s, the Roaring Twenties. We're going to look at this time of prosperity, which has a lot of interesting events and circumstances, a lot of different actions. Some of this will be, in a way, a review of the Progressive era and the results of the Progressive era, and some of these will also really foreshadow the coming Great Depression. So what was life like in America in the Roaring Twenties? Well, first and foremost, after World War I, there was really a beginning of like a super patriotic, jingoistic, rah, 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 America is great movement. This was especially accompanied by anti-radicalism. Around the world, the great turmoil from World War I and even beforehand was polarizing the world. There are many assassination attempts, extremist organizations being formed. But in America, these enemy reds, or these like predecessors of the communists, became really criticized in society and excluded from labor unions' efforts as well. In addition, you had this bizarre resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s. There was a movie, Birth of a Nation, that really helped fund and raise recruits for the Ku Klux Klan. And this was a real time of not just prosperity in America, but division in America too, racially and economically. In addition, the 1920s was a time when America really increased its quotas on immigrants coming from other countries. Countries were completely shut out. For example, like Japan had a large immigration population before. Some of the quotas favored other countries over different nations. So while immigration slowed in America in the 1920s, it especially was halted for certain immigrant groups from different countries. The actual effect of these immigration laws are really to limit immigrants. This is an ongoing effort throughout the 1920s to limit immigration and put these quotas or limits on how many immigrants come from certain countries. And as you can see, really limiting immigrants from Northern and Western Europe, but less limits on those countries than the rest of the world. During the 1920s, alcohol was illegal. This was prohibition, the real fruit of the temperance movement. But despite alcohol being illegal, speakeasies, or illegal nightclubs where organized crime and other profiteers were trying to organize and make money off of alcohol being illegal, the social scene for adults in the 1920s ironically revolved around alcohol, even more so than when it had been legal. And in addition, there were continuing efforts by different labor unions, workers groups to improve the effort. You see this in photos from well before the 1920s, but you notice that like throughout the 1920s, labor organizations and especially blue-collar laborers still continue to try to organize and advocate for workers' rights. And in addition, of course, like the crackdown on alcohol, trying to get rid of alcohol throughout America. And again, the connection to organized crime, right? Like organized crime really had a thriving time period in the 1920s, partly funding the alcohol industry and also other things like gambling. And America was also a time of different changing ideas in the 1920s. The Scopes monkey trial in Tennessee was this bizarre and strange event where opponents of evolution really wanted to limit teaching evolutionary theories in schools. Baseball was, and you started noticing like all this stuff happened in the 1920s. How are they related? Well, it's true that as America grows and thrives and diversifies, many different events happen and many different effects and impacts cause different circumstances throughout the country. So in the 1920s, the car becomes much more ubiquitous. This is Henry Ford with his first car. The cost of the car was really dramatically lowered by the mass production techniques. automobiles and other industries really start to utilize assembly lines and other mass production techniques to cut down the costs and make their products cheaper, being able to sell more products to more people, and of course, really raising the amount of automobile consumership in the United States. So you sort of notice the automobile really takes off in the early 1900s in America, and we are still a real driving nation. Of course, New York City is a little different. You also see then, of course, this is going to have a major impact on the landscape of the country. Strip malls, gas stations. This is how America really is transformed by the automobile. And in addition, airplanes begin to be not just featured in military and commercial use, they also get to have like a place in American society. There's this fascination in the 1920s with stunt airplanes, who can fly across the Atlantic Ocean first, who can do it solo like Charles Lindbergh. And these sort of like new heroes or real like social influencers of the 1920s have impacts on fashion, impacts on music, dance, and speaking of the music, this is also the time period where like the jazz age of the 1920s, and many Americans are able to listen to music at home or in social gatherings. You also still have, this is like a continuation of the progressive movement, efforts for and by women to improve their societal status. Women have the right to vote from the 19th Amendment, but there are still many social limitations put on women that Margaret Sanger and others are advocating against, such as women's reproductive rights. And jazz. So, in addition to jazz becoming a very popular art form in the 1920s, it's also accompanied by this racial divide and cultural appropriation. You can see in like this Jim Crow era image that both African American jazz music is being celebrated and popularized, but it does not necessarily mean economic or social gains for many African Americans. Quite the opposite. During this time period, the fashion also greatly changes. There is really, I want to call it like a sexual liberation for many women who are allowed to cut their hair short, who are dressing with looser clothing, shorter cuts, and these flapper dance styles and dress styles are a big part of women being able to express themselves more independently throughout the 1920s, continuing the effort of feminists from the 19th century and the early 1900s. But of course, right, it's not progress without the opposite effort to try to limit progress. There are, for example, dress codes that go into effect to try to reduce the scandalous effort of women showing their bodies or of this sexual liberation movement. Jazz is a major thing. There is a huge jazz influence. This comes along with the Great Migration. As many African Americans leave the South and move to cities, they bring gospel music, soul music, and jazz music, which catches on throughout America and really influences future movements like rock and roll. There's also going to be ongoing efforts by Marcus Garvey, the NAACP, and many other Black advocate groups to try to improve the African American communities around America. The Great Gatsby is written. There's also going to be a huge prosperity boom during the 1920s. You notice, like people they have different clothing. They have more clothing. They have time for leisure. They have time for music. They have time for the speakeasies. And that is really reflected in both The Great Gatsby and also in some of the poems and music of the Harlem Renaissance. Harlem has a real resurgence during this time period. And of course, where are our politicians? Well, they don't really matter because during this time period in the 1920s, the presidents presiding over the jazz age or over businesses are really doing very little to limit or curb or deter the good times. The good times are rolling in the 1920s. And maybe they're rolling a little bit too much. There's going to be starting to be criticism of the government's, what do you want to call it? Started to be criticism of the government not handling business, or of business overly influencing America, like this political cartoon showing like the Washington, D.C. Capitol and different monuments for sale. You also really see that many Americans are more focused on home after World War I. There's not going to be an effort by the United States to engage in European affairs. America did not enter the League of Nations, which is collapsing with the time of this document. And this is going to cause real long-term economic detriments in Europe, around the world, that will come back to bite America during the Great Depression at the end of the 1920s. There are also going to be continued efforts to de-escalate America's military. This is also a part that the British Empire, initiative taken by the British Empire and America to reduce the amount of military weapons and naval weapons specifically. There's an oil scandal that rocks and lowers faith in the government. Calvin Coolidge is the president, right? He's concerned about fishing. Quite popular president at the time. Nonetheless, the times are good. So what criticism can you have of a president when the times are good? Businesses love Coolidge, right? Businesses love all of the Gilded Age presidents, some of the Progressive era presidents and the Roaring '20s presidents. There are not many efforts to check or limit businesses, so prosperity is booming. Cultivation is transforming the farming and agricultural industry to the detriment of many farmers' incomes, I might add, as they're producing so many goods and not able to make as much money as they had been in the past. And this populist vote, this effort by farmers around the United States to organize, make their own political party, make their own political movements, while of course more successful out west, doesn't carry any individual states and doesn't really make a dent in the cities and larger populated states of America. The economy is very loosely regulated in the 1920s. There's lots of loans to different countries. There are different debt payments that are supposed to go back to the United States from our allies and enemies from World War I. But at the same time, especially as we get into the 1930s, those economic difficulties in Europe outweigh the good times of the Roaring '20s. And as Europe falls into debt, so too will America have a hard time breaking out of an economic depression in the 1930s. After some years of Calvin Coolidge and other presidents, Herbert Hoover runs for president. He wins the election very handily in 1928. You can still see the solid South is a little less solid, right? You're having people in the South start to vote for the Republican Party and break away from the Democratic majority that had dominated Southern politics from like the 1820s. But there is going to be an economic crash, and the next video will focus on how these good times come to a screeching halt. Many people are in over their head and in debt, and once the economic crash comes in 1929, it's going to be a very long and hard road for economic and social recovery in America afterwards. So hopefully you enjoyed this video. I'll try to make an Ed puzzle out of it for extra credit too, and let me know what questions you have.